April 15th, 1931. Coney Island, Brooklyn. Shortly after 3 o'clock in the afternoon, police were called to a restaurant known as Nuova Villa Tomorrow on West 15th Street. Inside, one of the most powerful underworld figures in America lay dead beside a table where a card game had been interrupted by gunfire. The victim was Giuseppe Masseria, better known as Joe Masseria. For years, photographs of the scene have circulated through newspapers, books, documentaries, and Hollywood productions. One image became especially famous. Masseria's body lay on the restaurant floor, while a playing card appeared near his hand. The picture helped create one of organized crime's most enduring legends. But the real story was far more complicated. And decades later, one of the most famous mafia films ever made would present a version of that killing that differed significantly from what contemporary records, police reports, and historical research suggest actually happened. To understand why Joe Masseria died that afternoon, it is necessary to go back long before the bullets were fired. Masseria was born in Menfi, Sicily, in 1886. Multiple documented accounts place his arrival in the United States during the early 20th century, when large numbers of Sicilian immigrants were entering New York through expanding migration networks. The city they entered was changing rapidly. New York's Italian criminal organizations were not yet the highly structured mafia families later described in federal investigations and congressional hearings. Instead, power rested in shifting neighborhood factions, regional loyalties, and personal alliances. Violence was frequent. Leadership was often temporary. And prison sentences rarely ended criminal careers. By the first decade of the 20th century, Masseria had already appeared in law enforcement records. Historical sources document arrests and criminal activity that placed him within the growing Sicilian underworld operating throughout Manhattan and other parts of the city. His reputation expanded steadily during years when organized crime remained fragmented and highly localized. Then came a series of developments that transformed everything. The first was Prohibition. When the 18th Amendment took effect in 1920, the illegal alcohol trade created unprecedented opportunities for criminal organizations. Smuggling routes expanded. Distribution networks multiplied. Corrupt relationships developed between criminals, politicians, and businessmen. Money flowed on a scale previously unseen. The second development was the weakening of older mafia leadership structures. As veteran bosses died, were imprisoned, or lost influence, ambitious younger figures moved upward. Among them was Joe Masseria. By the early 1920s, documented accounts identify him as the dominant leader of what would eventually become known as the Genovese crime family. His influence stretched across gambling operations, labor rackets, extortion schemes, and other criminal enterprises throughout New York. To supporters, he was a powerful protector. To rivals, he was an obstacle standing in the way of expansion. Authorities viewed him as one of the most significant underworld figures in the city. Yet the greatest threat to Masseria was not coming from police headquarters. It was coming from inside organized crime itself. Another Sicilian-born boss was rising. His name was Salvatore Maranzano. Maranzano had roots in Castellammarese del Golfo, a town whose immigrants formed influential criminal networks in the United States. As his power increased, tensions between his faction and Masseria's organization intensified. What followed became known as the Castellammarese War. The conflict was one of the bloodiest power struggles in early American mafia history. Throughout 1930 and 1931, shootings, assassinations, and retaliatory attacks claimed numerous lives. Established leaders disappeared. Alliances shifted unexpectedly. Individuals who appeared loyal one month were negotiating with rivals the next. Among Masseria's most important allies was Giuseppe Morello. Morello had been a major figure in organized crime for decades and served as one of Masseria's key advisors during the conflict. Historical accounts describe him as an experienced strategist whose influence remained considerable despite years of legal troubles and underworld warfare. Then he was killed. On August 15th, 1930, Morello and associate Joseph Periano were murdered in East Harlem. Contemporary reporting and later mafia histories identify the attack as a major blow to Masseria's position during the war. The balance of power began shifting. Every new killing increased uncertainty. Every funeral created new opportunities. Meanwhile, a younger generation of gangsters was becoming increasingly frustrated. These men had grown wealthy during Prohibition. They were less interested in old regional disputes and more interested in expanding profits. Several believed the continuing war was damaging business. One of those younger figures was Charles Luciano, later known to history as Lucky Luciano. Luciano had risen through Masseria's organization and possessed extensive connections throughout New York's criminal world. Unlike many traditional bosses, he worked comfortably with individuals from different backgrounds and criminal groups. As the war dragged on, his position became increasingly delicate. He owed his rise to Masseria, yet he also understood that endless conflict threatened everyone involved. According to multiple documented accounts, secret negotiations eventually emerged between Luciano's circle and forces aligned with Maranzano. Exactly how those discussions unfolded remains disputed among historians. What is not disputed is that major realignments were underway behind the scenes. Masseria did not appear to fully grasp how much support he was losing. Some allies remained loyal. Others were calculating alternatives. The environment surrounding him grew increasingly dangerous. Police surveillance of criminal activity continued, but law enforcement lacked many of the investigative tools later used against organized crime. Electronic surveillance was limited. Modern racketeering statutes did not exist. Prosecutors often struggled to connect bosses directly to violent crimes. As a result, underworld disputes were frequently settled internally, and internal settlements often ended in murder. Spring arrived in New York during 1931. The Castellammarese War had reached a critical stage. Behind closed doors, decisions were being made that would reshape the future structure of the American Mafia. One of those decisions centered on Joe Masseria. Historical sources indicate that arrangements had been set in motion. Meetings occurred, alliances shifted, plans advanced. The man who had dominated New York's underworld for years was approaching the final day of his life. On the afternoon of April 15, 1931, Joe Masseria sat down at Nuova Villa Tamaro with Charles Luciano. Before the meal was over, events would unfold that later generations would argue about for nearly a century. And according to the historical record, Luciano was about to leave the table. What happened next became one of the most examined killings in Mafia history. Contemporary reports and later historical investigations agree on several core facts. Joe Masseria was dining at Nuova Villa Tamaro on April 15, 1931. Charles Luciano was present. At some point during the meal, Luciano stepped away from the table. Moments later, gunmen entered the restaurant and opened fire. Masseria was struck multiple times. He died at the scene. The identity of the shooters has remained the subject of debate for decades. Numerous Mafia historians have pointed toward a group of younger gangsters associated with Luciano. Various accounts have named men such as Vito Genovese, Albert Anastasia, Joe Adonis, and Benjamin Siegel. Yet no court ever established a definitive list of participants, and contemporary law enforcement never secured convictions for the murder. That uncertainty became fertile ground for legend. Stories grew. Details changed. Popular culture added its own interpretations. The essential historical reality, however, remained unchanged. Joe Masseria was dead. The most powerful obstacle standing between Luciano's faction and a settlement of the Castellammarese War had been removed. Investigators arriving at the restaurant found a scene that quickly attracted public attention. Newspaper coverage spread throughout New York. The killing was viewed not merely as another gangland murder, but as evidence that a major shift was underway inside organized crime. Authorities understood who the victim was. They understood the broader conflict surrounding him. What they did not fully understand was how rapidly events would now move. With Masseria gone, Salvatore Maranzano emerged as the apparent victor. For a brief period, he stood at the top of the American Mafia hierarchy. Historical accounts describe a gathering of Mafia leaders later in 1931, during which Maranzano reorganized New York's underworld structure. He divided the city into what became known as the Five Families, assigning leadership positions and establishing a more formal framework for criminal administration. The organizational model would survive long after his death. Future federal investigations would continue using those family designations for decades. Maranzano also declared himself Capo di tutti capi, boss of all bosses. The title suggested supreme authority. On paper, it represented triumph. In reality, it created a new problem. Many younger leaders had supported change because they wanted stability and profit. They had not risked their lives simply to replace one dominant ruler with another. The same generational tensions that had weakened Masseria were now beginning to surround Maranzano. Meanwhile, law enforcement remained largely on the outside. Police departments continued investigating individual crimes, but they possessed only fragments of the larger picture. The sophisticated intelligence programs later developed against organized crime did not yet exist. Officers often saw isolated murders, while missing the broader strategic realignment occurring across the underworld. Inside criminal circles, however, the significance was unmistakable. The Castellammarese War was effectively ending. The bloodshed that had consumed New York's mafia landscape for more than a year was drawing to a close. Profitable rackets could resume normal operations. Bootlegging enterprises could focus on revenue instead of retaliation. Labor infiltration schemes could continue without the constant disruption of internal warfare. Money once again became the central concern. Yet beneath the surface, distrust remained. Several documented histories describe Luciano as increasingly convinced that Maranzano represented a long-term threat. Whether every reported detail of those concerns is accurate remains difficult to verify. What is clear is that relations between the two camps deteriorated rapidly after Masseria's death. Maranzano's position appeared secure. His actual situation was considerably more fragile. He had inherited power over a criminal landscape transformed by prohibition. The younger generation controlled enormous financial resources. Many of them had built networks extending beyond traditional Sicilian boundaries. Old formulas no longer worked as effectively as they once had. A new model of organized crime was emerging. Instead of regional rivalries, leaders increasingly emphasized cooperation. Instead of endless wars, they preferred arrangements that protected income. Instead of concentrating authority in one individual, influential figures began exploring collective structures capable of reducing conflict. Those ideas were gaining support. Maranzano's vision moved in the opposite direction. During the months following Masseria's death, reports of tension continued spreading through underworld circles. Later accounts from organized crime researchers indicate that Luciano and his allies became convinced that Maranzano was considering action against potential rivals. Whether every rumor was genuine mattered less than the effect those rumors produced. Suspicion accelerated. Trust eroded. Contingency plans emerged. The man who had benefited most from Masseria's murder now faced the possibility of becoming a target himself. Meanwhile, the public remained fascinated by the restaurant assassination. Photographs from the crime scene circulated widely. One image in particular became famous. Masseria's body appeared beside a table associated with a card game. Over time, the photograph helped generate a persistent narrative that the mafia boss died while holding what gamblers call a dead man's hand. Researchers have repeatedly challenged portions of that story. Historical examinations indicate that several popular details were likely embellished after the fact. The famous image itself may not accurately represent every aspect of the scene exactly as it appeared immediately after the shooting. The mythology grew larger than the evidence. This pattern would continue for generations. Books repeated earlier claims. Films borrowed from previous books. Audiences often encountered a dramatic version of events rather than a complicated historical record. By the late 20th century, many viewers would come to know Masseria's death through fictionalized depictions that blended established facts with creative interpretation. The actual case remained considerably less certain. No successful prosecution ever reconstructed the killing in court. No definitive judicial findings settled every disputed detail. What historians possess instead is a combination of police records, contemporary reporting, later testimony, and extensive organized crime research. Taken together, those sources point toward a conclusion accepted by many scholars. The murder represented a strategic elimination carried out during the final stage of the Castellammarese War. Its consequences were enormous. One era ended at that restaurant table. Another began almost immediately. For a few months, Salvatore Maranzano appeared to stand at the center of the new order. The structure he created would influence American organized crime for decades. The authority he claimed for himself would not. Summer turned toward autumn. Behind the appearance of stability, another conspiracy was taking shape. The same forces that had helped remove Joe Masseria were preparing to act again. And before the year was over, the man who inherited victory from Masseria's death would discover how temporary that victory truly was. And before the year was over, the man who inherited victory from Masseria's death would discover how temporary that victory truly was. September 1931. Less than 5 months after Joe Masseria was killed in Brooklyn, Salvatore Maranzano was dead as well. According to widely documented historical accounts, a group of assassins entered Maranzano's office in Manhattan and murdered him. The killing removed the man who had briefly emerged as the apparent winner of the Castellammarese War. 2 dominant bosses had fallen within a single year. The old system had collapsed. What followed was one of the most consequential reorganizations in American organized crime history. Charles Luciano moved quickly. Rather than claiming the title of boss of all bosses for himself, he helped establish a different structure. Historical sources describe the creation of a governing body that later became known as the Commission. The purpose was practical. Disputes could be managed. Territories could be recognized. Conflicts could be addressed before they turned into wars that attracted police attention and destroyed profits. The Commission became one of the defining institutions of the American Mafia. Its influence would extend for decades. In that sense, the death of Joe Masseria marked more than the end of a single criminal career. It marked the beginning of a new era. The violent struggle that had consumed New York's underworld during the Castellammarese War gave way to a more organized and centralized system. Many of the most powerful mafia leaders of the 20th century emerged from that transition. Yet the murder itself remained unresolved. No criminal trial ever produced a complete legal reconstruction of the events inside Nuova Villa Tomorrow. No jury ever heard a definitive prosecution identifying every participant. No convictions were obtained for the killing. As years passed, investigators, journalists, and organized crime historians continued examining the case. The available evidence consistently pointed toward a conspiracy connected to shifting mafia alliances during the final phase of the war. But important questions remained unanswered. Exactly who fired the fatal shots? Who coordinated every aspect of the operation? What specific agreements were reached before the assassination? Those questions generated competing theories for generations. The absence of courtroom findings allowed speculation to flourish. Some stories became accepted as fact despite limited evidence. Others grew larger each time they were retold. By the middle of the 20th century, Joe Masseria's death had already entered organized crime folklore. The public image often overshadowed the historical record. That pattern accelerated after the rise of mafia books, television programs, and feature films. Among the most influential portrayals was Martin Scorsese's film Goodfellas. Although the movie is widely praised for its depiction of organized crime, its brief reference to Masseria's death helped reinforce a version of events that many viewers accepted without question. The problem was not that the film was documenting history. It was not intended to be a documentary. It was dramatizing a criminal world for narrative purposes. Over time, however, dramatic portrayals became mixed with historical memory. As a result, many people came to believe details that cannot be fully verified through contemporary evidence. Researchers studying the assassination have repeatedly emphasized the distinction between documented fact and later storytelling. The documented facts are powerful enough on their own. A major mafia boss was murdered during lunch. His death helped in a gang war. The political balance of organized crime shifted almost immediately. A second boss was murdered months later. A new governing structure emerged. The American Mafia was permanently transformed. No embellishment is necessary. The real events were already extraordinary. Law enforcement understanding of those events developed gradually. Federal authorities during the early 1930s did not possess the extensive organized crime intelligence systems that would emerge later in the century. Many connections between criminal leaders remained poorly understood. The federal government's more aggressive approach toward national organized crime networks developed over subsequent decades. By the 1950s and 1960s, congressional investigations, law enforcement intelligence gathering, informant testimony, In major hearings exposed far more information about mafia operations than officials had known during Masseria's lifetime. One of the most significant turning points came in 1963. That year, Joseph Valachi provided testimony before the United States Senate. His statements offered unprecedented public insight into mafia structure, membership, and traditions. Although Valachi was discussing events long after Masseria's death, his testimony helped explain the organizational world that had emerged from the struggles of 1931. Subsequent federal investigations continued expanding that understanding. In later decades, prosecutors relied on powerful legal tools that did not exist during the Castellammarese War. Racketeering cases targeted entire criminal organizations. Electronic surveillance produced evidence previously unavailable to investigators. Cooperating witnesses revealed internal operations in remarkable detail. Many mafia leaders who inherited the system created after 1931 eventually faced federal indictments and lengthy prison sentences. The organization survived. Its power diminished. The era of near-total secrecy slowly eroded. As for the principal figures in the story, history records clear outcomes. Joe Masseria died at Nuova Villa Tamaro on April 15, 1931. Salvatore Maranzano was murdered in Manhattan on September 10, 1931. Charles Luciano eventually became one of the most influential organized crime figures in American history. In 1936, he was convicted on compulsory prostitution charges and sentenced to prison. After serving years behind bars, he was deported to Italy in 1946. He died in Naples in 1962. Vito Genovese later became one of the most powerful mafia leaders in the United States. In 1959, he was convicted on narcotics charges and sentenced to federal prison. He died while incarcerated in 1969. Albert Anastasia rose to leadership before being assassinated in a Manhattan hotel barbershop in 1957. Benjamin Siegel was murdered in Beverly Hills that same year. Joe Adonis was eventually deported from the United States and spent his final years in Italy. The generation that reshaped organized crime rarely escaped violence, imprisonment, exile, or all three. Their victories proved temporary. Their fortunes shifted constantly. Their alliances rarely lasted. The photograph from the restaurant still survives. For decades, it has symbolized the end of an era. Yet the image captures only a single moment. The larger story is what happened afterward. Joe Masseria's death did not bring stability. It triggered another killing. That killing led to a new structure. That structure influenced organized crime across the United States for generations. The legend became famous. The reality was harsher. A struggle for power consumed the men who built it. Most eventually met the same fate as the rivals they had removed. Murder, prison, or decline. The historical record leaves little doubt about the final lesson. Organized crime produced wealth for a few and destruction for many. The names changed. The leadership changed. The system evolved. But the violence at its core remained constant. And on an afternoon in April 1931, when Joe Masseria rose from a restaurant table for the last time, that reality was already written into the future of the American Mafia.